webinar tackling the subject of heritage impact assessment in the Asia Pacific region. My name is Stacey Vallis, and I'm the president of ICOMOS Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I will be moderating this session with support from Jane Harrington, the past president of Australia ICOMOS, who will be our rapporteur. So our regional vice president, Sue, was unable to join us for the session, but sends her best wishes. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you in the session, but just to kick things off, I would like to now hand over to Sohadi Hartono. The floor is yours, Sohadi, to set the scene. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacey. Hi, everyone. I'm Sohardi Hartono. I'm the president of ICOMOS Indonesia and also the chair of this of the organizing committee of this webinar series on heritage impact assessment. I welcome you all, and amidst your busy schedule, you put aside some time to share with us and to learn about this heritage impact assessment. As we know, in our modern world, constant changes and development pressures apparently are inevitable within the cultural and historic landscape of our heritage places or historic sites, where we are all working as heritage professionals or heritage practitioners. And the situation is even more pressing in Asia Pacific region. And however, we still believe that conservation is essentially how to manage changes. And so we at the Asia Pacific ICOMOS Regional Network, we decided that it's time for us to share experiences, knowledges from our colleagues and from the experts throughout the region on this subject, which is very important to and very relevant to all of us. Here in this webinar, we will discuss and exchanging knowledge on heritage impact assessment, about the procedures, the processes, the theoretical framework, and more importantly, the best practices. And this is the third session, the third edition on Australia, Pasifica, and New Zealand. The first two have been organized couple of months ago. Started with Southeast Asia edition in the end of November, and then East Asia recently at the mid of January. And now we are at the third session with distinguished speakers and experts from this sub-region, Australia.
Sebenarnya kan mau ipat ini mau edit tapi tak sempat.
We can't hear you at the moment, Sohadi, but if we could ask everyone to please ensure your microphones are switched off if you're not speaking. Thank you.
All right. And of course, this webinar will be not possible without the kind assistance and collaborative efforts from my colleagues at the working group. So please remember these names. Faisal Abdurrahman, the president of ICOMOS Malaysia, and Alex Yen from Chinese Taipei or Taiwan, and then Ji-Hon Kim from Korea, Kai Weis from Nepal, and Tina Paterno from the Philippines. Each session will have a rapporteur. So there would be a compiled reports at the end of five sessions, and this will be presented to our regional meeting in Korea next April. And of course, now we are working on the other two remaining editions, which will be the turn for South Asia at the end of February, and then for our colleagues from East and Central Asia to present their cases on the third week of March. And for the purpose of getting to know more about our upcoming regional meeting in Korea, in which the heritage impact assessment would be one of the main topics, we will have Professor Choi, the president of ICOMOS Korea, to give introduction to this very exciting meeting in mid-April. So please, I welcome Professor Choi. Time and stage is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Sohardi. This is great to have you all here today, and thanks for giving me a chance to introduce the Seoul regional meeting here. May I share my screen? Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the event places from the April 15th this year to the 18th this year. The location is the Konkuk University, which is located at the east side of Seoul. And the main theme, the umbrella theme, is challenges and collective responses facing heritage in the Asia-Pacific region. And there are four main sub-themes. One is the HIA, as we are discussing now. Second one is the heritage interpretation issues, and then climate change and disaster management. And finally, we like to take the integrating approach, combining all of the different UNESCO heritage. So this title is just a new way forward, and which is the meeting is organized by the main ICOMOS Korea, WIPI, that is the Category 2 center located in South Korea, and the Korea National Commission for the UNESCO, and the ICOMOS ICIP. And it is hosted by the Korean Heritage Service as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we have a couple of institutions to support us. And what we expect is that after the COVID-19, we have no chance to see each other face to face. So this is, I think, the first chance to meet each other face to face meeting before the Nepal GA meeting. And also we have to share a lot of ongoing the issues and the main themes together. And then who will join? We just open our doors to everybody here. There is no registration fees, so you can free to come here, and we will provide you a meal. And then, but accommodation is because of we have a very limited the budget, so I cannot guarantee all of you to provide some financial assistance. But definitely, we invite one person per each national committee within the Asia-Pacific region. So mainly the president. And if president is not available, maybe he can recommend another person, like a secretary general or vice president to us. Then we will give an invitation letter, just mentioning about the full supporting. And also there are, like we are designed for the maximum 150 persons participants together. So I hope everybody here is free to come by here and enjoy the nice the mood during the springtime. And this is a draft program just to show you the main days. The first day is 15th of April. That is we're going to have a welcoming dinner together. And the second day, starting from the conference day, and the second day will cover two different subjects like heritage impact assessment and interpretation issues. And each sub-theme has one plenary session and one thematic section. Day 2, we will cover up the climate change and the disaster management and then comprehensive approaches. And this is also composed of the plenary session and the thematic section. And the last day, the morning session is the ICIP session. And then after that, we're going to have a field trip for all of us together. But there are a variety of courses, so you can choose according to your own preference. And that is the scenery for the conference hall. We call the Prime Hall that is located in the Student Center at Konkuk University. And Konkuk University is my university, but it is one of the top 10 university in South Korea. We have a large lake inside the campus. This is a view, and looking, you see the south to the east part of Seoul. And here is the main gate that is located in second floor. then you can see the main hall. And here, this is the main hotel, conference hotel, at the discounted rate. And then this is a hall, prime hall, and the main hotel. And the distance is just 2 kilometers away, just a half-hour walking distance, but only 2 stops by the subway. And then if you would really love to join us, maybe I recommend you visit our ICOMOS Korea webpage here. And we'll open the general participant starting from 19th of this month. And then you can fill out the registration form, and that's it. And then send your registered form to the email address, and you can see at our webpage. Okay, this is all. Thank you, Stacy, and thank you, Mr. President, Indonesia.
All right. Well, thank you so much to Sahadi and to Professor Choi for taking the time to join us. Right, so at this point, we have a few housekeeping tips just to ensure a smooth program for us. And they are, well, firstly, to everyone, please note that the session is being recorded. We are also requesting that you please ensure that your microphones are switched off if you are not speaking. But please do feel free to post your questions in the chat, and the speakers will pick them up during our Q&A segment at the end after all speakers have finished their presentations. So with that, if there aren't any further questions at this stage, I have the privilege of introducing our first speaker, and no doubt he is someone that many here will know very well. So our first speaker for this session is Professor Richard MACKAY, AM. He is an ICOMOS World Heritage Advisor, an honorary member of ICOMOS, and the co-author of the Guidance and Toolkit for Impact Assessments in a World Heritage Context, prepared by the UNESCO World Heritage Center through the World Heritage Leadership Program. He has undertaken multiple missions and worked on impact assessment, along with tourism and management at World Heritage properties in Europe, as well as across the Asia-Pacific region. He is a former chair of the Australian World Heritage Advisory Committee, and of course, we will know him well as the convener of the Global General Assembly that took place in Sydney in 2023. So with that, thank you so much for your time, and over to you, Richard.
Stacey, thank you, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning to colleagues in the Asia Pacific and around the world. I speak to you from the lands of the traditional owners, the Camaragal people of the Gadigal Nation in Sydney, Australia, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'd also like to thank the organising committee and ICOMOS Malaysia for this really beneficial webinar series and for the opportunity to present to you. And as Stacey has indicated, I'm talking about the new World Heritage Impact Assessment Guidance and Toolkit, which was prepared by the advisory bodies in conjunction with UNESCO and was launched in 2022. Can someone shout out to me if you can't see the second slide, just so I know that we've got technology working?
Looks good, Richard.
Thank you. So I will go fairly quickly because I have a short amount of time and a lot to cover. And I'm conscious that at the first webinar, my friend and colleague Eugene Zhou introduced the guidance, and that reference was also made to it in the second webinar by my colleague from Whittrap, Li Hong. Basically, the World Heritage Convention imposes obligations on state parties about notification of projects and about undertaking impact assessment. And particularly in relation to paragraph 172, state parties are required to notify the World Heritage Centre of activities which may impact on the outstanding universal value of World Heritage properties. And the guidance is very much directed at that paragraph and at paragraph 118 bis of the operational guidelines to the World Heritage Convention, and intended to support state parties, practitioners, site managers, and all involved in the system in undertaking impact assessment, particularly within the reactive monitoring processes of the World Heritage Committee, and particularly to focus on the attributes that support the outstanding universal value of World Heritage properties, understanding whether the impacts are acceptable, and making well-informed decisions about whether the action should proceed, and if so, how. And as Eugene shared in webinar 1, the current guidance shown on the right of the screen now incorporates material from and replaces the previous ICOMOS guidance from 2011 and the previous practice note of IUCN. So it's intended that this new document covers all sorts of World Heritage property. The document presents a core logic for impact assessment, and it begins by recognizing that it's necessary to understand how attributes of properties contribute to their outstanding universal value. It then provides a means to relate the attributes to the impact of potential changes. It ensures that there's adequate documentation and source material available. It documents the logic of the decision making. Very importantly, it separates identifying the impact from evaluating the impact, and it guides decisions on how to avoid or reduce adverse impact. And I'd emphasize that this guidance is all-embracing. It covers all sorts of place, project, and issue, from the monumental or the landscape scale right down to an individual building. It can cover archaeological sites, natural sites, mixed sites. It can cover conservation projects, tourism initiatives, and it deals with the tangible and intangible attributes of places. So, as you will have seen in webinar 1, this model, this guidance, has 11 steps, and they are shown on the screen, and I will speak briefly about each of the 11 steps. This summary diagram highlights that there are two overarching processes. One is about participation, and the other is about proactive problem solving. And it divides the 11 steps in 3 groups. The group on the left, which is the darker orange, is usually undertaken by the state party or the management authority or the site manager. The bright orange section in the middle is actually the Heritage Impact Assessment project or report, usually undertaken by a team, sometimes consultants, sometimes in-house. Desirable that the team is independent. And then finally, there are some reviews and decisions made, and that's the green.
Whoops, I think you might be muted, Richard.
It has muted me, sorry. Thank you. So I've just been talking about the diagram on the screen, and I'm highlighting that the green part is usually undertaken by the state party, sometimes with input from the World Heritage Centre. Now, in terms of participation, the diagram on screen summarises the participation process, and I just highlight, obviously we have specialists in the right-hand corner. That will be the HIA team. And we have our institutions, the site managers and the government in the top left-hand corner. It's also important, and ICOMOS is increasingly good at involving the people in the right-hand corner, the local community, traditional custodians and the like. But we find it's also important to have other sector specialists, the people who actually know about the action, because that's when it's possible to identify alternatives and sometimes develop innovative solutions that avoid or reduce adverse impacts to attributes that support the OUV. And I just put up on screen a couple of examples of those two bottom right-hand corner participants in the process. On the left, an example from Uluru in Australia, where traditional owners have the right to speak for country. They have a right to participate in the HIA process, and they bring to that a knowledge and an important perspective. And on the right-hand side, the example I'll show later in the presentation, an HIA for a port development in the old town of Galle, a World Heritage Site in Sri Lanka in our region. And I just highlight that the proposal had a very bad adverse visual impact on the property. And what it took was advice not from a heritage specialist, but from a coastal engineer who was able to say, this is another way to do the project and thereby significantly reduce the adverse impact. And then the second overarching process, other than participation, is proactive problem solving. And this needs to happen at every stage. You need to involve associated people, bring a multidisciplinary approach, identify information gaps, separate the identification from the evaluation of impacts, look at things holistically, and consider alternatives. So as Eugene particularly highlighted in webinar number 1, HIA doesn't happen at the end of the project when it's all designed. HIA happens throughout the project with the aim of avoiding or at least minimizing the adverse impacts. And I'm going to scoot very quickly through the 11 steps in my remaining time. The first step is the screening. It's working out whether or not an impact assessment is required. And you'll see in this little graphic, which is taken from the guidance, as are all the graphics in this presentation, if you've got something which has permanent or irreversible, it's large scale and it's within the property, it's on the left and it's likely to need an impact assessment. It's not likely to need an impact assessment if it's small scale, reversible, temporary, and it's in the wider setting of the property, and it's not likely to impact on the OUV. However, once we've decided we do need to undertake impact assessment, the next step is to scope the project. And there's two elements really of the scoping. One is, what is the proposed action? And it's important to include the totality of the action. If it's a development, what will the site be like when it's operating? What preparatory activities will need to be undertaken so that the totality of the action is understood? What are the alternatives that might form part of the assessment? But then also there's the other side of the scoping is the what do we need? What steps do we need to go through? What information do we have? What resources will we need? Who should be involved? So scoping is all about preparing a brief which identifies firstly what the project is, and secondly, what do we need to bring the HIA together? The third step is probably the most important step and the most undercooked step in many HIA processes. And it's got a number of elements, but it's basically about getting a baseline to undertake the work. And an important part of the baseline, particularly for properties that have been on the list for a long time and may not have a current statement of outstanding universal value, one of the most important things to do is to assess the attributes that support OUV. And I put up here another example from our region, in this case, the Taj Mahal, and highlight that if you go to the World Heritage Centre website, you can see within the language of the statement of OUV itself, some clues about what the attributes are. So in the case of the Taj, it's a masterpiece of architecture. It's in good condition. It shows balance, symmetry, harmonious blending of various elements, and it's got functional and visual integrity. So the statement of outstanding universal value itself is helpful to understand what are the individual attributes. Then what the guidance does is it provides you with a means to translate those attributes into a chart form and relate them to the proposed activity. So in our baseline assessment, we're looking to understand what are our values, what are our attributes, and a quick clue for practitioners and those involved is to say that the values in a statement of OUV are the why statements. Why is this place important? And the attributes are the what statements. And what I put up on screen here, it's done by another colleague, not by me, but it's just using a highlight, orange underline and some green boxes with a statement of OUV. This one's for the city of Rome. And it's dividing it into the why and the what components, which can then be translated across into Tool 1 from the guidance. And Tool 1 is simply a spreadsheet where you can list the values and list the attributes. And if you're very diligent, you might also list a relevant source of information. So in the middle column of the box on the right, we have a set of attributes that relates to the outstanding universal value of the property. And this is all taken from the pseudo case study in the guidance, which is the Blue Sea Marine Park and the city of Heratopolis. So it's an imaginary place, with lots of values, lots of attributes. And you can see here, just using the top line, why is it important? It's important because it's an ecologically globally outstanding region. Then in terms of its attributes, what is important? It's the blue sea, marine and terrestrial areas. And so it is the attributes rather than the reasons that get affected by proposed actions. And that's where the guidance focuses the attention. And I'll just say quickly, the other thing that needs to be done as part of the baseline assessment is to assess the state of conservation without the action. In other words, how is the property now? What's its integrity? What's its physical condition? That might need a site inspection. It might need analysis of documentary evidence. And one of the best places to go for that is actually the nomination dossier, often held by ICOMOS, which was lodged at the time of the nomination, because that gives you a very good baseline template of how the property was at the time it was inscribed. And that, in the World Heritage System, is the benchmark for impact. So we've done step 3. We now need to understand the proposed action and the alternatives. And the important thing to highlight here is that we need to understand all elements of the proposed action, not just the bit where we're building. So there might be preparatory actions such as site clearing or archaeology. There might be downstream actions such as operations or decommissioning. And we need to lay these out so that we now have a baseline understanding of the attributes that support the World Heritage OUV of the property. And we have an understanding of the totality of the action that's proposed. And that's where tool 2 comes in. So tools 1 and 2 put together, we have our chart from the previous slide with the attributes down the middle column. And then we transfer this across into tool 2, and we can match those attributes against the elements of the action. And we can say which of the things we're going to do are going to affect which attributes of the property. We're not judging anything at the moment. We're just looking at where they intersect. So we have the attributes down the left and the elements of the proposed action across the top. So what is it that may affect the attributes? Now we have a good understanding of the relationship between the action and the property. And I mentioned that I'd show you the example of Galle. This is the old town of Galle in Sri Lanka. It was a proposed port development. And you can see it out there, a very large development which would have had a major impact on the visual integrity of the property. And to cut a long story short, and I just highlight that on these slides, visible on the recording, you will find references to some of the impact assessments that have been done. What was undertaken here was that it was identified that this development would have an unacceptable visual impact. And I'm jumping ahead, but what was ultimately determined by analysing that was a modified design to the port, such that it looks as it such that it's approved as it looks on screen at the moment. And of course, the coastal engineer input was critical to that. Which brings us to the relationship between tools 2 and 3. So tool 2 has identified that the intersection between attributes and the action. And then what we do from that is we can describe the potential impact. And then tool 3 is where we actually evaluate that. We need to think about things like reversibility or duration or frequency of the impact. And the information in the toolkit sets this out very nicely in a spreadsheet form. And then it proposes a grading and color coding system so that where we have an impact that's permanent, that it's major, then it'll be high. Where we have something that might be temporary, might be not very serious, obviously it's low or negligible. And we have found that the color coding in the World Heritage System is extremely effective because when you provide the summary page of the report to the decision maker, they go straight to the red bits, and that's where you have the dialogue, where you have the major negative unacceptable impacts. So what I'd like to highlight is that between tools 2 and 3, something very important happens. Tool 2 is about identifying what the impact is. In other words, where will the attributes potentially be affected? And tool 3 is about saying, how bad is it? So that there is that assessment undertaken. And that happens in step number 6 using tool 3. So having done that, and having changed the project, the other thing that's really necessary, and I know I need to move quickly here, is to look at mitigation and enhancement. And what that might mean is a bit of a redesign, in which case you need to reassess the proposed action and the alternatives. And I put in another example of this from the region, this one from Australia, one that's rather well known to Jane Harrington, a project at the Cascades Female Factory, a component of the Australian Convict Sites World Heritage Property. And without boring you with lots of detail, this is an archaeological site. There was a new building proposed, and the solution to avoid the impact, which was identified at an early stage of our iterative process, was to raise the building so that the archaeological remains would not be impacted. And it was possible in this case to go from an adverse impact into a neutral impact, notwithstanding that there was a new building built on top of the archaeology. So at step 7, what we do is we mitigate and enhance. We seek to avoid or minimize the impacts. Step 8 is reporting. The important thing about reporting is that it needs to be standalone. It needs to outline the attributes. It needs to identify the impact. It needs to assess the severity, consider the alternatives, and importantly, and this is often left out in the material that comes before the World Heritage Committee, a clear evaluation of whether or not the project should proceed. The example I've put on screen is not from our region, it's from Villa Adriana, which is an Italian property. And when we come to the final step, or the penultimate step, you'll see why I've included this. But this is just an example of some extracts from the report that show really clearly where the project is, where the property is, and have one of these color-coded grading bars that draw the attention of the decision makers so well. Step 9, I won't go into in great detail, but step 9 involves reviewing the report. And that happens in 2 ways. It happens within the state party through the national decision maker. In other words, is the report fit for purpose in its national jurisdiction? But also, if we're dealing with the World Heritage property, because of paragraph 172 of the operational guidelines, reports also go to the World Heritage Centre, and quite often there is a technical review done by one of the advisory bodies for cultural sites. That's normally by ICOMOS. Step 10 is when the decision is made. And here again, I've put back Villa Adriana. I put this up because it's one of the very few major heritage impact assessment reports done for a World Heritage property, for a big development, where the HIA itself resulted in the project not proceeding. And you can see there in dark font that the conclusion was that the only option available to the state party that would totally avoid this situation, which is an adverse impact on OUV, is to halt the development project. And that is exactly what happened. And I'm sad to say that that's the exception rather than the rule. All too often what happens is that HIA reports are done after a minister has already announced a project, and HIA focuses on mitigative actions, not on that core decision about whether or not the project should proceed. Step 11 is the final step in our guidance. And it's a step that's quite often left out. We do the report, we follow stage 1, but it's important that the outcomes of the report, particularly if it's recommended mitigation, be embodied in the position in the permission, whatever approval might be given by a domestic agency issuing a development consent or agreeing a budget allocation. These need to incorporate whatever was promised in the heritage impact assessment. And then that needs to be carried into the project guidelines, the commissioning of a contractor, the tender document, however the project is going to be implemented. And the bit that's particularly left out is the fine detail about proceeding to implement the project in accordance with the commitments that have been made, and indeed monitoring to ensure that that occurs. So the follow-up, the implementation of the mitigation measures, is an integral part of the process that's summarised in the guidance. Now, I'm just going to give you a very quick advertisement. As many of you will know, ICOMOS globally is rolling out a capacity building for impact assessment in a World Heritage context, a series of courses. These are being facilitated by ICOMOS Paris, and I welcome my friend and colleague Christina Bicheva, who is online from Europe at early ungodly hour of the morning. Hello, Christina. So she is the coordinator, and these workshops and training courses are undertaken collaboratively with national committees of ICOMOS, and they're intended to inform and guide national and local stakeholders. They spend the best part of 5 days elapsed time going through the guidance and toolkit and getting people to understand the principles and processes. But these courses are also targeted at raising awareness of the importance of HIA in local and regional World Heritage context. You can read a lot faster than I can talk, and there will be a recording, and you've probably got your phone out taking a picture. But the way the course works is that there are 2 separate online sessions. Then there is a 3-day residential component, usually at a case study World Heritage property or in the vicinity, and then there's a follow-up online session. So there are 6 components, and 3 of them in the middle are a residential component. And as I say, the way these courses work, they are collaborative endeavours between ICOMOS national committees and ICOMOS headquarters in Paris, with the involvement of experienced World Heritage advisors who are familiar with the guidance and the process. And I just simply, there's a little bit more information on this screen to say that they're usually for 20 to 25 participants. That the way in which they come about is national committees need to liaise with Christina at the Secretariat. Her details are there on screen. Or if you're not quick enough, just send an email to the Secretariat at icomos.org. And importantly, the way this process has been designed is that typically there'll be a couple of trainers who are international and a couple of local trainers, so that progressively as these courses are rolled out, individual national committees are able to build capacity. And I'd finally say that Christina herself will be at the meeting in Seoul and will be presenting about this program. So that is a whistle-stop rapid tour through the World Heritage Impact Assessment Guidance and Toolkit. And I'd be happy a little later on to respond to any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing your vast experiences with us, Richard, and also helping us set the scene for this session. So I'd like to briefly take a moment to welcome our Regional Vice President, Sue, who has just joined us. Thanks so much for your time. So with that, we will now proceed with our second speaker, Heike Lutz, who will share a perspective from the New Zealand context. So Heike is a seasoned architectural conservation specialist with nearly 40 years of experience. As an independent hearings commissioner and a mediator, she brings vast experience in resource management to numerous environment court and council hearings, often serving as an expert witness. She is the founder of Beacon Consultants Limited, where she helps shape practice through urban development. She has served on panels for councils nationally, and in doing so has contributed to district plan reviews, infrastructure development, and heritage protection. She has also published peer-reviewed papers and has presented at various conferences on urban design, planning, heritage, of course. So with that, the floor is yours, Heike. Thank you.
Kia ora, as we say here in New Zealand, and that covers luckily everything from good morning to good evening. As you know, my name is Heike Lutz, and it's a very great pleasure for me to speak to you tonight, especially on this significant day in New Zealand, in New Zealand's history and heritage. Every year on 6 February, New Zealand commemorates the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1844, which is an agreement between the Indigenous Māori and the British Crown, with a national public holiday, which we are observing today. Now let me share my screen with you. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes, thank you, Heike.
Yeah, just one moment. Socrates once said, "We do not know what we do not know." And this statement holds particularly true too when it comes to the formats and toolkits used for assessing heritage impacts. With this in mind, I explored how other countries approach this to determine whether we here at the far end of the world are excelling or falling behind. My research involved a comparative analysis to evaluate the strengths and challenges of New Zealand's heritage impact assessments, formats, and toolkits. We all recognize the fundamental role of HIAs in ensuring that cultural heritage values are identified, understood, and adequately protected during development planning. However, the formats and toolkits used to prepare these assessments vary widely. They are shaped by international guidelines, such as those established by UNESCO and as introduced just before by Dr. MACKAY, which apply in a World Heritage context, as well as by national policies and district plans tailored to our local context. Every region of the world takes a slightly different approach to heritage impact assessments, which is not surprising, since heritage values vary across cultures and the methods used to protect them differ accordingly. I have briefly summarized the continental approaches, including those from Europe, Africa, the Asia-Pacific region, and Australia, and as Australia is our New Zealand's closest neighbour. This is a very broad and brief summarization, and I would like to highlight some key differences in heritage impact assessment approaches across those countries. In the European Union, it is integrated with environmental impact assessments under the European Union law. They focus on holistic integration of heritage with environmental and social factors. Comprehensive guidelines and structured methodologies are a strength of their system, whereas heritage is sometimes underemphasized compared to other environmental factors. The African approach aligns with Sustainable Development Goals for balanced development and heritage protection. They focus strongly on community involvement and intangible cultural heritage. Their strength is the participatory methods and recognition of cultural heritage in a broader social context. However, they face a challenge of limited funding and technical expertise that hinder effective implementation. The wider Asia-Pacific area responds to rapid urbanization impacts on heritage, particularly in China, India, and Southeast Asia. Their focus identifies resources, assesses socioeconomic impacts, and promotes adaptive reuse. Addressing urbanization and challenges effectively is a strength of their system. It challenges the inconsistent implementation and enforcement across different countries. Now, Australia, which we in New Zealand take as our big brother and as a bit of a guiding hand, is based on strong legal frameworks for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous heritage protection. Their focus uses the Borough Charter to guide heritage identification, impact analysis, and adaptive management. Their strength is a strong stakeholder involvement and legal protections. However, balancing competing interests in heritage conservation and development is a challenge that they face. In summary, I would say the EU focuses on structured legal integration within the environment impact process. Africa prioritizes community engagement and intangible heritage, but faces funding challenges. The Asia-Pacific addresses urbanization pressures with adaptive reuse strategies through enforcement, though enforcement varies. And Australia has a robust legal framework and strong Indigenous heritage protection, but struggles with development pressures. Now, let's have a look where New Zealand sits in all of that. New Zealand's heritage protection is part of the Resource Management Act, in short RMA, which governs our resource management, and that includes heritage resources. It requires the identification and assessment of heritage, which is predominantly focused on colonial heritage, as well as cultural impact assessments, CIAs, which center on Māori cultural values. Additionally, Heritage New Zealand Pohere Taonga Act protects archaeological sites, mandating assessments for developments that may impact these sites. The identification of heritage values is primarily guided by district plans. However, due to the absence of a national standard for heritage protection, approaches vary significantly, leading to inconsistencies in what is protected and how it is safeguarded. Key components of New Zealand's approaches include the integration of cultural impact assessments for Māori cultural values, which can only be prepared by the affected iwi, which is the tribes. Mandatory iwi consultation for developments impacting cultural or environmental heritage, reflecting the holistic nature of Māori values, which encompass land, water, flora, and fauna as an integral part of the heritage. Recognition of both tangible and intangible heritage with a broader holistic framework. New Zealand's Heritage Toolkit is somewhat limited unless supplemented with international guidelines. And the UNESCO guideline is, as far as I understand amongst my colleagues, very appreciated and well used in the assessment process. Our available resources here, outside of that, are iwi management plans, which are developed by those tribes, Heritage New Zealand guidelines for archaeological assessments, GIS and digital mapping tools for sites identification and protection are provided by some local councils through their computer systems. We have the ICOMOS Aotearoa New Zealand Charter, which actually gives us a background on the values and how we need to look at them. Historic Heritage Impact Assessment Guide for State Highway Projects is one of the very few New Zealand own guidelines that have been published by the New Zealand Transport Authority that includes the assessments only for projects that are affected by state highway projects. Yeah. Social assessment guidelines we do have as well, and these are issued by the Ministry of the Environment. They include the assessment of social impacts regarding heritage, but that is only one small part of the bigger social impact assessment. In conclusion, compared to international standards, New Zealand excels in integrating intangible heritage and Indigenous knowledge, setting a standard for participatory, culturally inclusive assessments, at least to a certain degree, and much more than other countries do. However, like many other regions, New Zealand faces challenges in addressing emerging issues such as climate change impacts and is underperforming in key areas, including the provision of appropriate tertiary education for heritage professionals outside of museum studies, the development of a national standard for heritage protection, which is crucial for ensuring consistency in heritage identification, assessment, and impact evaluations. Ensuring greater standardization and education in the heritage sector will be essential to improving New Zealand's heritage impact assessments in the future. And I thank you very much for your time tonight. and hand back to Stacey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heike. So at this point, we will head back to Sydney, Australia, and welcome our third speaker for this session, being Peter Romey. Peter has had more than 30 years high-level experience providing input to heritage conservation strategies and projects, working with various firms, government organizations, and as the conservation director at a World Heritage Site. He is currently director of Romey Heritage, a board member of Oz Heritage, and the convener of the Australia ICOMOS World Heritage Reference Group. He has prepared expert reports on behalf of ICOMOS for development at World Heritage Sites, including the Sydney Opera House, but also at Samarkand and Bukhara in Uzbekistan. Thank you so much, Peter. Over to you. And if we could ask
Stacey for that, and thank you to ICOMOS Malaysia for organising this series of webinars. I need to acknowledge in the first instance that I live and work on the unceded lands of the Guringai people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'll begin with a brief overview of the role of HIAs in the heritage planning system, in Australia that is, with an emphasis on Sydney, and then I'll briefly discuss three very contrasting case studies where the HIA was a key component in the approval of projects. I'll conclude with some observations about how HIAs are used, and I'm sad to say occasionally misused, in the heritage planning system. In Australia and many other countries, the accepted methodology for the management of change at heritage places is generically known as values-based heritage management. This will be familiar to many of you. That methodology has evolved over the last quarter of the 20th century and is based on an understanding of the multiple cultural heritage values associated with a place, and it aims to protect and manage these values in a holistic manner. This diagram illustrates the process. The heritage impact assessment, which is a very common term in Australia, but it's also known as the statement of heritage impact or heritage impact statement, is a key tool for determining the potential impact of development, and as Richard says, hopefully how to avoid or mitigate those impacts. It's important to note that this process is generally applicable in Australia, irrespective of whether the heritage place is a world, national, or just local, state or local heritage significance. So it's not just a process that's applicable to the top end, if you like, World Heritage. Australia, partially at least due to the work of Australia ICOMOS, has been a leader in developing best practice heritage conservation methodology. The Borough Charter was first published in 1979. The Conservation Plan by Dr. J.S. Kerr was first published in 1982, and this is the Chinese language version published in 2017. The HIA was the next logical step in inscribing values-based heritage conservation methodology into the statutory planning system. As I mentioned earlier, the methodology is applicable to all heritage places, even those of only local significance. This is the City of Sydney specification for an HIA, and the use of an HIA has been a component of the city's heritage planning scheme since the year 2000, with the City Development Plan or Heritage Plan in 2000, and it was actually in use before that. But we don't always get it right, as I will demonstrate later in this presentation. I'll briefly now discuss three case studies in Sydney where the HIA has been an important component in the process of managing change at heritage places. The first case study is a building that you will all recognise, the Sydney Opera House. It was inscribed under Criterion 1 on the World Heritage List in 2007 because of its outstanding universal value as a great architectural work of the 20th century. But I'm sure you will all agree it's much more than that. It's a building that is highly valued by both the local and the broader community. And it's a place where we gather for events and performances of all kinds that enrich our artistic and even our political culture. In 2021-22, the Sydney Opera House carried out a substantial range of upgrade works to improve the functionality of the building. The changes were extensive but internal and mainly concerned with two main issues. One, improving the acoustics in the main auditorium, and two, facilitating disability access through the building. A comprehensive HIA, which was 150 pages, I'll mention that because it'll pop up again later, was prepared to address the potential impacts of the upgrade works. The HIA concluded that there would be some adverse impacts on fabric, but that these would not compromise outstanding universal value, while at the same time improving the core functionality of the building and enhancing its long-term viability as a performance venue. The HIA analysed each component of the scope of work and rated these in terms of the potential impact. This is another version of the colour coding that Richard was talking about. The potential impact on the detailed heritage values of the affected components of the building. The upgrade project was carefully scrutinised by not only the New South Wales and Australian governments, but also UNESCO and ICOMOS. I represented ICOMOS in this review process. On the basis of the HIA and an objective analysis of potential impacts, the project was eventually approved by the Australian and New South Wales governments, and the upgrade works were carried out. So these are the changes to the concert hall, the corridor that was inserted to provide greater access. So a good outcome. The second case study is a building that you will not recognise. It is the Community Hall in Pearl Beach, which is where I live, a small village north of Sydney, listed as an item of local significance. It's not yet listed on the World Heritage List and is unlikely to be, but like the Sydney Opera House, it's highly valued by the community. It was built by volunteers in, built by volunteers in 1950, and then has been cared for by the community since then. It needed to be upgraded from time to time to ensure that it is able to fulfil its key function as a performance and a meeting place. Between 2019 and 2024, a scope of work was undertaken to improve the internal thermal performance of the hall and to improve the functionality of the outdoor spaces. That's the interior of the hall. You see there, Pearl of the Pacific. That was in the original 1950 version of the hall. This is the section of the local planning scheme which relates to the preparation of a heritage management document. That is an HIA. An HIA, 8 pages long, was prepared to address the potential impacts of the upgrade works. The HIA concluded that there would be some minor adverse impacts on fabric, but these would not compromise the key historical and social values of the hall, which is why it's listed as a heritage item, but would enhance its functionality as a community place. On the basis of the HIA, the project was approved by the local council and the upgrade works were carried out. So in principle, this process was the same as for the upgrade at the Sydney Opera House, although of course the level of detail and degree of analysis was very different, but the process was essentially the same process. So the final case study is particularly as important as it is an example of where the full HIA process was followed, but you will need to judge whether the outcome will conserve the cultural heritage values of the place or not. This is the former Parcels Post Office in Railway Square in Sydney. It's listed as an item of New South Wales state significance as part of the Central Railway Station complex, and it's also listed as a local significance item by the City of Sydney. In the 1990s, it had been adapted for its current use as a hotel. You'll see the roof extension there that was done in the 1990s. This image here is the former Parcels Post Office in 1916 and shows its relationship to Central Railway Station. This relationship remains a critical aspect of the setting of the building today, but that is about to change. In the 2012 City of Sydney Planning Control, the site is in the blue circle there, imposed a height control of 35 metres on the site and a very restricted height control for new development on adjacent sites out of respect for the building and the railway station complex. In 2020, the New South Wales government decided this precinct should be intensively redeveloped as a tech hub and overrode the height control to allow for a high-rise tower development. The 35-metre height limit on the site of the former Parcels Post Office and adjacent sites was increased to more than 200 metres, from 35 to 200. This image illustrates the scale of the development proposed for this precinct. As expected, there was widespread opposition to these proposals, including from the National Trust, Australia ICOMOS and the New South Wales Heritage Council. A comprehensive HIA, 145 pages this one, had been prepared by Sydney Heritage Consultancy, which supported the proposed development. The HIA acknowledged that, and I quote, "The setting of the Parcels Post Office will be irrevocably altered in conjunction with the proposed development of the Western Gateway sub-precinct, but that its historical associations and visual connections will remain apparent and are able to be interpreted." The HIA argued that the acknowledged impacts could be mitigated by careful design of the new building, not reducing its height, detailed design, and concluded that the subject proposal is supported on heritage grounds. As recommended by the HIA, the proposed development was subsequently approved by the New South Wales Government. As I mentioned earlier, the government had in the first instance changed the planning controls for the precinct so that what was approved could not have been approved under the previous height and FSR controls. So here we have a situation where due process seemed to have been followed. An HIA was prepared to assess the potential heritage impacts on both the former Parcels Post Office and the broader historic Central Station complex. However, did the Consent Authority, the New South Wales Government, undertake a rigorous review of the HIA, or were the favourable findings of the HIA simply accepted as evidence that the heritage impacts of the proposed development were acceptable and or could be mitigated with careful design? This case study is really important because it demonstrates that following due process, while accepting the findings of an HIA without rigorous analysis can actually facilitate the approval of a development that is contrary to best practice, values-based heritage conservation. Checks and balances are essential, and the end user of the HIA, the Consent Authority, whether it's the national government, the state government, the local council, UNESCO, the World Heritage Office, must conduct a rigorous adequacy assessment of the HIA before accepting its findings. The former Parcels Post Office project demonstrates what can be the outcome when this does not occur. So, to conclude, here are my learnings about the Sydney HIA process, good and bad. I hope that these will be relevant to any jurisdiction that has incorporated the HIA into the development process. I'm encouraged that there are similarities with the conclusions of several previous presenters in this Asia Pacific webinar series. So here we go. The Heritage Impact Assessment, or other versions of it, such as an archaeological assessment, is and are a critical part of the heritage development process. 1. 2, heritage places at every level are important, some to the whole world, others only to a local community. But the proper assessment and development through the HIA process is critical for all heritage places to protect their heritage values. 3, the HIA must be prepared at an early stage of the process, and other presenters have mentioned this, when modification of the development to address heritage impacts is still possible. 4, the HIA must be prepared by independent heritage specialists with appropriate expertise and experience. All of those adjectives are important. Independent, expertise, and experience. 5, the consent authority must review the HIA before approving any development. If not rigorous and objective, the HIA should be revised or even rejected. And finally, the HIA reports, AA reports and so on, it's really sensible to compile them and catalogue them for public access and accumulation of knowledge about our heritage places. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for sharing your thoughts. So our next speaker, Pamela Shivelska, will focus on the importance of heritage impact assessments in managing change to local heritage, and will also share her insights from New Zealand. So by way of a short introduction, Pamela is a New Zealand registered architect with 12 years of experience in practice. That includes a year abroad to complete the building conservation program with the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, the SPAB Scholarship. She is an associate with the award-winning practice Salmon Reed Architects here in Auckland. And in this role, she has worked on significant projects of various architectural styles, typologies, for seismic upgrades, various design alterations, recladding works, as well as large-scale repairs and maintenance. Most recently, she's very proud of the work on the Te Tii Waitangi Marae, which has been a refurbishment and a seismic upgrade to the historic masonry building, which was in fact reopened on Monday, and that was ahead of Waitangi Day that is currently taking place here in New Zealand, as pointed out by Heike earlier on. So with that, the stage is yours, Pam. Thank you.
Kia ora and good evening, everybody. Ko Pamela Shivelska, toko ingoa. Welcome, and it's very nice to be part of this session on talks. My one might be a bit slightly different, being an architect in practice. So most of my work is really actually active in working with buildings on sites. So I have to write heritage impact assessments as part of my work, but it's overall part of the development and design phase of actual projects in real time. So I'll just share the screen, making sure I get the right document, hopefully. There we go. Okay. Stacey, can I get a confirmation you can see that?
Looks good.
Thank you very kindly. So given that the discussion is about issues and challenges from someone that's 100% in practice, the list here is the issues and challenges I face on a regular basis, week to week with my job. So one by one, when we've got things like that in New Zealand, property culture tends to be centred upon private ownership rights over community and future needs. What this usually looks like is that urban and suburban sites continue to have a practice of NIMBYism and the right to develop as they like, rather than on the individual properties, rather than as part of a collective heritage setting. We get a lot of housing and heritage playoffs, including largely at government level. And that's because we've got a lot of heritage areas, particularly in centre city areas or special character areas that have high value, are close to transport routes, and that people want to develop for intensification on housing. But unfortunately, there's still a disparity on economic needs, because housing is often, it's the affordable housing area that we need to boost, and these areas that the heritage is in is usually of much higher value, so it still doesn't necessarily solve our housing issues. Earthquake strengthening requirements. This is ongoing and probably will be for decades to come. This was a huge mandate and shift in earthquake strengthening due to the Christchurch earthquakes in 2012. And as time has gone on, it's only been 13 years, but many of the mechanisms and availability for funding projects to make these buildings safe has either petered off or is no longer available to private owners. Clients, their designers often come to us after they've actually completed design work. So they ask us to just simply sign off designs rather than contribute to making better decisions and have good discussions around what can or shouldn't be done in certain areas. There's the added costs, which are seen as bureaucratic rather than necessary to protect heritage. And that probably back to the points above, we need people engaging us sooner. Early practice engagement means that you'll get better outcomes, and most consultants and specialists would say the same, or whether they're structural engineers, infrastructure works, you name it. So essentially, we want early engagement with us as heritage architects because we're critical to be able to navigate the changes that are required to building sites to align with both policy and building regulations. But too often we're compartmentalised and brought later into the project, or we won't receive the projects at all because we're seen as not meeting a developer's choices. I also think it's always really important to check in philosophically of why we need these things, because if you do have a client that is kind of on your side, it's an easy win, but there's often times where we have to state our argument and hopefully to improve and maintain our urban settings. So what we don't want is to lose too many buildings, and we don't want to have that significant a change in our urban environments, and we want to have some control over it so we don't get poor development either. We don't want to see our cities and even our suburban and rural areas taken over by the mentality of some sheds will just do when they won't, especially in relation to heritage. So I thought it was important to say why it is that we need the heritage architect. So me and my role in particular is because, well, it's about being able to review building policies and regulations. As the baseline and being a design architect, we know how to navigate the Resource Management Act, which HIA mentioned, the building regulations, the unitary plan. I mean, I predominantly work in Auckland, but we could work in amongst any particular plan. And all these things then backtrack into the policy work of both the RMA and local schedules of the unitary plan. The building code is actually incredibly important because the more that you know about your building regulation system and how to actually construct of different typologies, including your contemporary ones, the better decision making you can make for building changes. Another reason why we're the best placed people to write heritage impact assessments is we're able to read buildings. We're able to take on and understand their architectural styles, form, proportions, materials, date them, and understand them from a technological point of view, as well as for style and therefore their importance. Ooh, I skipped one there. More about being able to read buildings is that when we get involved with the building, is it's in helping with navigating its change. So you've got to be able to read the building once all those terrible linings have come off, and you actually see how the building has changed over time, what's been appropriate, what's been inappropriate, if it hasn't been recorded, the opportunity to record. And it's really about knowing what you've got on as your building before you get stuck into trying to change it. And a lot of the last few decades hasn't included enough recording of our buildings and a lot of unmitigated change. I also think it's important that as heritage architects that we actually question and challenge more about what's going to happen in our urban environments. The two pictures on the left is in central Queen Street, Auckland, on a junction of Victoria Street. The top photo, top left, is the building that used to be there, and the bottom left is the building that we have now there. Same on the right-hand side, just further up the same street, but opposite what's now the ANZ. Used to be an old hotel building, and now we have a car park. So if we don't challenge these things, or we allow developers to decide what our urban environments look like, we actually lose really interesting and beautiful buildings. And then, of course, there's the overlay now, which is getting increased amount of attention, which is sustainability, the use of resources of our materials, that every time we send buildings, we demolish buildings, we're essentially sending them to landfills instead of making use of what we've got. As the heritage architect again, the reason we're good for writing heritage impact assessments is because we can also challenge the type of materials being used. So we can challenge that the use of materials will have impacts on our buildings. New materials, when they become used on old building materials, help to deteriorate them further. And we have to be on top of what those changes are going to be and what those material uses are going to be that are proposed. So again, that they don't have negative effects on our heritage impacts. So this is an example of the workflow that I typically work to. If I get a client come in and they're prepared to work with me on doing the right thing by a building project, usually because they've got a scheduled building, the first thing I will do for them is start checking on the planning and heritage policies that they have to work to. We insist on investigating the building, what they have now, how it's not working for them, what's original fabric, what changes that haven't been recorded have occurred to the building, checking property files, doing background historic research, asking what is it that they need changed and why. There's a lot of reasons for these things to get changed, but you've got to start getting clever on how you do it with managing the impact that you'll have on the building. A lot of people want to change buildings and they have lots of grand ideas of manipulating them from the interiors, but actually a lot of work can be done separate to those interiors to keep them intact, and proposing something externally, for example. And sometimes they think that by adding modern cladding systems, for example, that they're going to get a better result than if they just repair the existing masonry wall that they have. So then we take those things, we go through a design process to integrate what their needs are, because we can propose that challenge to them of, is it really appropriate to manipulate your building the way you think it should, or can we suggest something different? And once we've implemented those design changes, hopefully with their blessing, we can actually complete the heritage impact assessment. And sorry, I forgot to mention there, as in part of the how and why does it need to change. This is also the part where I would go through and actually scrutinize our building regulations requirements. So if there's the earthquake strengthening and fire escape routes, we get to the bottom of what their actual statutory obligations are versus what is just the nice to haves. Because often these things, because they will cost so much, actually mean that they can only do minimal things anyway. So we start to make it more cost effective for them, because we bring forward a process that is usually left later to a building consent phase and bring that forward. And then we're able to complete a really robust heritage impact assessment with everything included. So just very quickly, an example of that, it's just the one, I'll whip through it, is working on an old Masonic lodge in Auckland Central. These are the old linen plans. It's largely untouched plan-wise by them. A little bit of historic research to show what the building was likely looking like, albeit a little bit blurry because it's nice zoom ups of very, very old photos. But what we have here is essentially a brick masonry building with lots of narrow slit windows, and what looks like a clay tile roof. What we have now is a plastered and painted building. We've had some earthquake strengthening done, albeit not recorded, a cladding system, unfortunately an asbestos-based one, which has changed slightly the expression of the externals of the building. You'll recall here, we don't see any columns, so they've kind of changed the overall appearance of the building. This is the front street end, this is the rear car park end, and theirs is a classic example of they're experiencing vandalism by the neighbouring buildings with people unfortunately throwing things off balconies, which is destroying their roof. They're getting leaks inside. Because the building hasn't changed in a long time, they need to upgrade their accessibility routes, their means of escape. Their facilities are no longer adequate for the amount of population they hold for their events. And it's a very community and public engaging set of people. And so, you know, for all the want and need of change to the interior alterations that they wanted to do to accommodate all that, I've instead suggested that they actually just build an extension to the back, something that follows in similar proportion to the existing building, and that then will house all the modern intervention that they need and therefore minimises the impact on the historic building. So pending some agreement from them, hopefully we'll get this over the line as a concept, and I'll be able to write that heritage impact assessment, and we'll get on with helping these people enjoy the use of their building for years to come. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pam, for sharing some very practical views and insights for us here today. So that brings us to our final audience. The format for this segment is that we will have time to put one or maximum perhaps two questions to our speakers. I can see that the chat has been burning up, and our speakers have already started to respond to some of these questions. So thanks to our speakers and of course to our audience for sharing your thoughts here. So with that, perhaps we can pick out one or two questions, and just to our audience, our sincere apologies if your question has not been answered as yet. We have taken note of these, and please do share this with us in the online feedback form, and we can direct it to our speakers after the session. If I could please ask everyone to please mute your mic if you're not speaking, that would be great. Thank you. Wonderful. All right. So I'm thinking perhaps we can kick off with our keynote speaker, Richard. Once again, I can see that you have picked up on several of these questions in the chat, but perhaps one that has not been raised so far is, in your view, what is the obligation or the advantages to use the new World Heritage Impact Assessment Guidelines?
Oh, thanks, Stacey, and thanks, colleagues. And I have tried to pick a few of the questions and respond, so happy to have some offline discussion with any of the participants. Firstly, let me say this guidance has been prepared for World Heritage, but we have found it works beautifully across all of the jurisdictions. We are yet to find a problematic jurisdiction, but what tends to happen is that, particularly in the baseline assessment, it's sometimes necessary to add extra columns to Tool 1 to deal with the specifics of local legislation or guidelines, and sometimes the way in which heritage value, for example, is expressed in different jurisdictions may need to be unpacked in that table. But broadly speaking, this guidance works for World Heritage properties right through to local heritage properties, but it's a question of undertaking the work in a way that is commensurate with the nature of the place. As I've indicated in response to the question about how long does an HIA take, for example, if it's a simple building and it's a simple piece of building work, then the issues, the attributes, the baseline, the impacts, the changes are going to be reasonably straightforward, and it might take a couple of weeks. But if it's a cultural landscape and there is a major resource extraction project, that's the kind of HIA that could go through multiple multiple iterations and need multiple experts, and tool one becomes a volume all in itself, and it takes several years. I think I've meandered around a bit, but kind of answered the question.
Thank you so much. Thank you. No doubt.
But actually, Stacey, while I think there's one other important point which goes across a number of these questions. The guidance is not like a computer. You don't put in the data and get a magical answer. You still have to do your work as the expert. But what the guidance does is it provides a rigorous framework and very transparent and very accountable, so people can see the basis on which judgments were made. If they want to, they can haggle or argue or query some of the judgments. It's still necessary for the decision maker to make the decision. But where this guidance really helps practitioners, particularly with the tools and the charts and the colours, is it gives a rigour and a framework, so that what is historically been a very subjective methodology becomes much more ordered and consistent.
Thanks so much, Richard. Thank you. Right, well, I've got one now for Heike as well, who I think has picked up on some of the questions directed towards her in the chat. So Heike, sort of bearing in mind the points that you've raised, in your view, what are some key factors for effective HIAs that we can learn from the global context, from other countries?
Thank you, Stacey. I think I can keep that very short, because it's not a hell of a lot that needs to be changed and needs to be done. It's just a matter of a strong legal framework will actually help a very long way along the way to actually get things consistent and ensures compliance with it, because that's the problem that I found many countries have, that there is regulations, there is maybe guidelines, but unless and as long as they are not legally binding, there is lots of ways working around it and ignoring it or doing it half-heartedly. And so that strong legal framework is really important. The other thing that is very important is the integration with the urban planning and environmental assessments, because unless on a local level it has been integrated in an appropriate manner, and hopefully nationwide in the same manner, and we've experienced that in New Zealand that this is not the case, this will actually help that everybody knows it from the word go. When they develop a project, they know exactly by looking in the district plans what is required and what needs to be done. And this is what needs to be written in there so people can follow it. The other point is the involvement of suitably trained heritage professionals, and I can only commend Pamela's presentation today. As an architect myself, I understand every word and I agree with everything she says, because it is important that the right people are involved, but it's also not only historic heritage architects that need to be involved. There's other people that actually have equally a part to play when it comes to those sites. Clear guidelines and assessment methodologies should be available, and we have the guidelines, and Richard has confirmed to us that it's not only for World Heritage, it works in any situation, and I think the more use of guidelines like that should be encouraged, and people should actually use as much of what has already been given to us as they can. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heike. Thank you. I'm actually going to pick up on a question that was put to our speaker, Peter, from, I believe it was Alex Yanning. So the question is, Peter, what is the relationship between DCP and heritage impact assessment? specific question there.
Okay, all right. Hi there, Alex. Nice to hear from you. I'll just be very brief about that. They're two sides of the same coin, I suppose. A DCP is generally, in Australia at least, a development control plan, a detailed set of principles, at least, sometimes quite detailed, about what kind of development is appropriate in a usually area-based conservation areas and so on. So they're the DCP is the starting point below the overall heritage legislation. The heritage impact statement is really an assessment of how well the proposed development complies with the DCP. So the DCP is a fairly high level set of principles, but as I said, sometimes quite detailed. And the DCP hopefully is an objective assessment of adequacy, of compliance with the DCP. As I think I made it fairly clear in my talk, that doesn't always happen. So, and I think a couple of the other speakers have referred to the scenario where the HIA is basically not rigorous, not objective, and has been prepared to achieve a certain outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So up next, I've got a question for Pam, and that is, be keen to hear if you could share any tips, advice, key, say, resources for, say, students, emerging professionals who might be interested to learn about this work and who might be at the start of their professional journey working on these big topics.
Thanks, Stacey, and thank you, Heike, for your lovely compliment. It's always nice to know we're in the game together, in the sister and brotherhood that is heritage. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to understand construction practice. Knowing the building regulations as they are currently is one thing, but to actually understand craftsmanship in carpentry, masonry, construction techniques, and how they're executed both traditionally and how they deal with things in the current setting, so that everyone's making good choices, is a way of being able to get to the detail level of what people are trying to ask of buildings, never mind changing them. So it's being able to go and see that broader heritage impact in your urban setting, your rural setting, and then being able to zoom in at particular details and then zoom back out. Because design architects on their own will often just sort of see their vision and not be able to integrate it adequately. So my questions usually, if I'm just working in a consultant position on someone else's design, is to ask what those details are starting to look like, to make sure that my heritage impact assessment is clear, or give them guidance on what things they need to change. So for young professionals that are looking to train, if you can get to places like the UK and do scholarships like the SPAB have, there's plenty of training opportunities in the likes of Italy and Rome. There's probably a few others dotted around Europe, and certainly the one in Australia and Tasmania by the APT, the Longford Academy. Any opportunities in your local areas to learn your cultural craftsmanship skills, whatever they look like, because it will be different culturally, but based on your vernacular. So anything that you can do to get in touch with local craftsmen, have a go at things, learn the language of them, and actually have a go at making with those things will always lead to better outcomes going forward as an architect.
Thank you so much, Pam. Definitely, again, a focus on the practical aspects and getting in there with the materials themselves. I know that's been an important part of your sort of personal and professional philosophy for a long time. So thank you so much for sharing that. So at this stage, I'm again mindful of time. So I suppose I'd be we'd be happy to open the floor. If there are any last burning questions that people would like to post in the chat to our speakers, this is your chance. We've got a wonderful lineup here in front of us. I don't see anything further coming through. Yes. I think one of our speakers, Richard, you raised your hand.
Thanks, Stacey. Yes, there was an earlier question comment, I think, from Helen Lardner from Australia. And I just think in response to that, she makes the good point that there is also the question of a balancing impact on different attributes. You know, sometimes you can't make the omelette without breaking some eggs. And I just make the comment that the way the guidance works, particularly the chart presentation and the different colors, it makes it very easy for the practitioner and the consent authority to lay out what are the different effects and then to do scenario planning, for example. So there are some great examples in the World Heritage System of iterative HIAs or multiple HIAs that look at differential impact on different values and attributes of both World Heritage and national and local heritage places. And I'd encourage people to do that. Again, it doesn't give you a magic answer, but it does allow you to see what decisions you're making in a very transparent way. And thank you again to everyone who's participated.
Thank you so much, Richard. Wonderful. Okay, so I think at that, I'd once again like to say a big thank you to our wonderful lineup of speakers who've joined us here today, as well as to our wonderful audience for your interesting questions. I think it has been a real treat to have an opportunity to learn from all your insights as we tackle the challenges and the opportunities for managing change across this vast and diverse global region that we find ourselves in. Lastly, a big thank you to the teams, to Sohadi for driving this initiative. We're very grateful for the chance to be here. So I was just asked to say just a short note to those who have joined us. Please do fill in the online feedback form. We'd be keen to hear your thoughts. Sohadi here, and yes, I see the QR code, the feedback form on screen. Sohadi, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Stacey, and thank you very much to all our speakers, Richard, Peter, Pamela, Heike, and sorry if I forget somebody. And this is just a very excellent session. And we look forward to welcome you all again to our next session on South Asia to be organized by the end of February. And most of all, we want to thank our colleagues from ICOMOS Malaysia, who has been so kind in providing the Zoom platform since the first session and now and until the fifth session. And thank you very much for your attention. And thank you so much, Stacey, and to all our distinguished speakers. See you all next time. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.